Welcome to another episode of Why the Beatles Matter. I'm Sean Gaillard. Let me give you a date. August 29th, 1966, Candlestick Park, San Francisco. What would become the Beatles' final public concert. It is one of the most discussed moments in Beatles history. We know the stories, we know the set list, we know what came next. What we sometimes forget is that history is made up of people, humanity, people laughing backstage, people doodling on a tablecloth, people sharing a joke, people standing at a crossroads without fully knowing what comes next. My guest today is Amelia Davis, owner of Jim Marshall Photography LLC and curator of the extraordinary new book, The Beatles by Jim Morrison, Jim Marshall, live at Candlestick Park, 1966. Amelia, welcome to Why the Beatles Matter. It is truly an honor, and I'm grateful for you joining us on this kind of on the cusp of the 60th anniversary of Candlestick Park, and all of the success of this brand new book from Jim Morrison, curated by you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I tell you, my listeners are going, Sean, okay, stop with the Jim Morrison. It's Jim Marshall. That's the second time I've done that. So
That's okay.
apologies to Jim. Sorry up there, both Jims up there. Um, I think some of it too is behind you
Right.
is the Jim Morrison
We were talking
picture,
about it. Yeah.
which we were just talking about. So Jim Marshall, and let me tell you, um, his work is iconic on so many levels, not just in terms of rock history and 1960s pop music history and all those things, but just in terms of capturing kind of the zeitgeist of social change, social reform, and being our eyes for us and so many with so many iconic and important people.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the genius of Jim. He always called himself a reporter with a camera. And that's really what he was. He would see through his camera and show us exactly what he was seeing. And that's what he really felt was his duty. That was his love, photography, and really um, documenting pieces of history that were happening that will never happen again. And especially when you're a photographer of that period, you can't set this stuff up. If you took a terrible photograph, you can't say, "Oh, I'm sorry, can we redo that?" So Jim was really amazing at capturing the moment. And somebody referred to him, I just thought this was funny, that he was the Cartier-Bresson of music photography. And that's really
Love
true
that.
because if people don't know who Cartier-Bresson was, he was a very famous photographer
Hmm.
that had the saying, the decisive moment. And really, the decisive moment was just what it was. It was capturing that moment in that split second and recording it on film. And that's what Jim did.
And there's such an art to it. There's, we take for granted that, we have these iPhones with these kind of miniature, you know, um, studios and things, and we can take endless amounts of pictures, provided we have the space. But, I grew up in a time where film was
Yeah.
expensive, and
Yes.
you only had a certain number. I only had a certain number of shots on my little Kodak Instamatic,
Yeah.
and in many cases, in Jim Marshall's case, there are deadlines. There's in some cases dangerous situations,
Yeah.
or the rush of Beatlemania, or what have you. So
Yeah. Yeah.
tell for our listeners who may not be familiar
With Jim.
with Jim, just a little bit about him, and who he is, and his legacy.
Sure. Well, Jim is completely self-taught. He did not go to school and study photography. And he basically grew up in San Francisco. And all of his heroes hero photographers were war photographers. So like Robert Capa, people like that, they were all Magnum photographers and they used Leica cameras. So Jim was like, I want to use a Leica camera. They're very expensive though. I mean, just today, even the body alone is $5,000. So it's, it's really expensive. So Jim in 1959 bought his first Leica camera in San Francisco. He put money down and paid it off over a number of months
Wow.
to purchase this Leica. And then he just hit the streets and really taught himself different lighting situations, how film reacted to different motions.
Hmm.
And he was actually lucky to be in San Francisco at that time because North Beach in San Francisco was the jazz hub at that time.
That's right.
That's where Black Hawk was. That's where the
Yes.
Hungry Eye was. Enrico's. That anybody in jazz would play in North Beach, and that's where Jim first met John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and he had these lifelong friendships with these guys.
Yeah.
But it also was the kind of poetry, counterculture kind of movement that was starting in that time. You had City Lights books.
Hmm.
So you had Fairlyn Getty, you had Allen Ginsberg with Howl, you had all of these different things that were happening around that time. So Jim had a wealth of subjects to photograph. And that's really where he taught himself, so much so that it became a part of him. And he always carried, if you see pictures of Jim, he has about 5 or 6 cameras like us hanging around his neck because he used fixed lenses. So he knew, you didn't have the zoom lenses then. You had these fixed lenses. He knew which lens would be good for that situation. He had it loaded with black and white and color because he preferred black and white, but a lot of times for album covers, they wanted color. So he always had, one of those Leicas loaded with color, and he used Kodak Kodachrome slide film, and he used Tri-X 400 black and white film. So he kind of really made a name for himself in the jazz and folk world on the West Coast. And then he decided, I really need to make a name for myself on the East Coast. So he moved to New York from San Francisco, and he was in New York from 62 to the very end of 64. And he then started working for Atlantic Records, a lot of the East Coast record companies.
Hmm.
Folk was happening then. That's where he actually met Bob Dylan. So the famous tire shot of Bob Dylan rolling a tire down the
Yeah.
street, that's Jim's. That's actually where he met Johnny Cash, was through Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan introduced Jim to Johnny Cash. And
Wow.
then Jim has a lifelong friendship with Johnny Cash. But so he had all of these, he knew John Coltrane, he knew Miles Davis, he knew Monk. So, you have the famous shot of Monk actually in his studio apartment. Well, not really a studio, it was a small apartment in New York City with his baby grand piano in the kitchen. And Jim did a whole photo series of that. So just, I think a lot of people know Jim's photographs, but don't know the name that goes with it. So that's Jim Marshall, who then was a part of that. And while he was on the East Coast, he also did some civil rights things that people don't know a lot about. He went to Hazard, Kentucky, photographed a coal mining family, just beautiful stuff. Went down to Mississippi, photographed when the voting rights was when they were trying to teach people how to sign up African Americans to vote.
Hmm.
So that was the Freedom Riders went down there. So 63, 64, Jim has that. So then he was like, okay, I've done that coast. Now I'm going to go back to San Francisco. So right at the end of 64, he came back. And that's really when 1965, the whole counterculture, Haight Ashbury was starting to just form and explode. during a very small period of time, 65 to 67. That's it. That was like, boom, it happened and then it was over in a flash.
Mm.
But everything that happened during that time period, Jim documented, and it really reverberated around the world. I mean, everybody around the world saw what was happening. And that's where Jim, photographed the Grateful Dead, the Charlatans, Quicksilver Messenger
Mm.
Service, Jefferson Airplane, all of those guys Jim photographed. And then, of course, the Beatles in 66. So it's such an interesting juxtaposition to think of the Beatles in 66 when you had this whole counterculture movement, people dropping acid and
Yeah.
doing all of that happening at the same time as that. But then again, there was Jim. He always had his camera ready to document what was going on. And I think we're really lucky for that because
Mhm.
history does tend to repeat itself.
Yes.
And, these were pieces of history that Jim had documented. And my hope, and I think it was Jim's hope too, by documenting these protests also were going on around this time as well on the West Coast. There were a lot of anti-war protests that were happening that Jim photographed. So it's very relevant to what we're feeling today. And I think a lot of the younger generation may feel like, does my voice really matter? What can I do? Is there anything I can do? And really look back on these photographs that Jim took of peaceful protests
Yes.
and really just being consistent with, saying, I oppose this, this is not right, this should not happen. It really can make a difference. And so, I hope that the younger generation can, maybe gain some inspiration and from those photographs, and maybe budding photojournalists, because photography still does matter even though we're in a digital world.
Yes.
Photography does matter. It can document and it can tell stories, and that is the best way to make sure that history is remembered, by documenting it on film, and so it will be there for future generations. So that's what I hope people can get from Jim's photography. But I digress. This is about the Beatles.
Oh, no, and actually, it's actually kind of a good seg to one of the things I want us to dive deeply into because um, Jim has such an eye for humanity. And
He
what
does.
strikes me the most about the photographs in the book is how human they feel.
Yeah,
And as you said, we're in the middle of San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury.
yeah,
It's not quite yet the summer of love. We haven't put on the Sergeant Pepper uniforms yet,
right.
but there is kind of a little bit of that time in the other photographs, kind of
Yeah,
the technicolor day glow. I mean, some of that's
yeah,
creeping through, but Jim Marshall, somehow seems to we're talking black and white,
yeah,
and the Beatles are backstage, which to me are those pictures are much more interesting
yeah,
than the performance pictures. But it, I think there's a lot of trust that's going on too. So
yeah,
how did Jim build trust with the Beatles, with Joan Baez, and some of these
right.
other folks that creep up in the book? Because
The
there's
photos.
a whole lot of trust here, because he
Yeah,
saw some stuff and could have captured
yeah,
it, you know.
yeah. Well, Jim actually had known Joan Baez from 1960. They first met at, there was a rally called Every Man, which was against protesting against nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
So she was very big in the free speech movement and anti-nuclear war and anti-war in general. So he had known her for a long time already. This is 66. They were already friends. But Jim was very chameleon-like, and I think he was able to read a room, read a situation, and be able to really fit in and get those people to feel at ease with him.
Hmm.
He didn't he he used all natural light. He did not like using flash or strobe lights. So his only equipment was his cameras around him. So he didn't come in with all of this equipment. He came in, people saw him, they saw him with the cameras. He just started shooting. So people then just accepted that and kind of forgot that he had cameras and that he was photographing them. And it's not that he became invisible, but they forgot he was there, that they were at ease. They trusted him. So he was able to get these intimate moments that weren't posed and people didn't know
Yes.
he was taking their photograph. But he also had the trust of all these people, all of his subjects, especially the musicians, because yeah, they were in compromising situations. They were doing lots of drugs at the time and things like that. But Jim never thought about publishing a photograph of anybody in a compromising situation. And so they knew that. They knew that he was never going to betray their trust. And that was one of the things Jim was the most proud of, is that none of the photographers, none of the managers or handlers ever complained about the photos that Jim published of these people, because they were always beautiful and they were always intimate and it always kind of showed their souls. And that's what the secret of Jim was, I think, you know.
Yeah. That's that's powerful and so true, and you get that sense in the book. Was there
Yeah.
anything as you were kind of revisiting these images, and I know there are some very famous pictures that have appeared in various Beatle documentaries and Beatle books, and I devour all of those. But was there anything that surprised you, revisiting these images?
Well, not really. I mean, I have to say, there are probably about 5 to 10 photos that everybody knows
Yeah.
that Jim that were out there. One of our goals for doing this book was because it is the 60th anniversary of this happening, and I really wanted to show the entirety of it, because there really wasn't a lot out there. And one of the things that we talked about, Jim was showing the humanity of the Beatles. So many times people thought of them as these gods, right? Oh my God, it's the Beatles. But when you look at the photos backstage, they're just human beings, and
Yes.
they're bored. They are so bored, because people
Yes.
don't realize also that the musicians, when they're waiting to go on stage, it's boring,
Hmm.
right? And so here are the Beatles, just bored. They're burnt out. They're
Yes.
tired. They're doodling on the tablecloth. They're drinking tea, not alcohol, which
Yeah.
is funny. So they're drinking endless cups of tea and they're just sitting there chain smoking and doodling. So Jim, captured that. So he captured the human side of them. And that's what I really love and wanted people to see, was that whole other aspect of it. And it was a locker room. People, they don't realize that this was Candlestick Park, was a baseball
That's right.
stadium. And so they were locker rooms. They weren't green rooms, and they put up these tables, and the catering company was Simpson's Catering in San Francisco. And to make it look better, they put white tablecloths
Yeah.
on the fold out tables to try and make it look better than it was. But yeah, Jim captured that, and he captured all of that. And then I included the proof sheets too, because
Yes.
again, being in such a digital world these days, there are people who have no idea what a proof sheet is.
Yes.
And so to be able to show that, and you can kind of see the train of thought that Jim had in the proof sheet and the image that he picked. And, a lot of photographers would pick what they call the hero shot, which they would then outline with a grease pencil,
Hmm.
and then forget about all the other photographs on that proof sheet, on that roll of film. And so going back, Jim was so good at what he did that there's 36 amazing photographs on that one roll of film, but he only would publish one. So, you can really see all of these fabulous photographs that Jim took, in the proof sheets. And it's kind of, it's like a writer's notebook. That's how they think of before they're doing a novel, they're putting their thoughts down. Well, the proof sheet is like Jim's notebook, right? It's his instrument, and that's how he documented things. And so I thought it was really, really important to include those proof sheets as well. So it gives you an inside seat to a time and a place that you would never have. Only nobody could be back there except the Beatles and meet and greets and, reporters. And Jim was the only photographer with a camera that was allowed back there to document that. So I think it's really special for Beatles fans and for photography fans too. It really gives you these different viewpoints into that moment.
Absolutely. There's a lot of something. There's a lot of everything in here for everyone.
Right.
Whether you are a Beatles fan, passing or obsessive, whether you are a student of photography, whether you are a student of history, whether you're a Joan Baez fan, or if you're trying to figure out what was Candlestick Park like before they tore it down, and
Yeah.
all of those things. There's just so many great bits here. And what I also appreciate about the book, because there's a narrative that you capture, through Jim's work, and I want you to talk a little bit about that, because we don't start in Candlestick Park. We don't. In fact, there's some context that you provide, kind of leading up to the final notes of the Beatles, when they run off the stage in
Yeah.
'66.
Yeah. Well, Joel Sylvan wrote part of the text in there, and
Yes.
he's known nationally as a music, basically historian, um, but mostly known really well in the Bay Area here, and was very good friends with Jim, and he's been stayed good friends with us. So I thought it would be great to have Joel to write that aspect of it. And so Joel, I was riffing off of my introduction, riffed off of what Joel was writing, where he gave you the history of the Cow Palace in San Francisco,
Yes.
which was another venue, and where Chubby Checker played
Yes.
in 1962, that Jim photographed just before he went to New York. So, and then the Beatles played at the Cow Palace in 64 and 65.
Hmm.
For me, I wanted people to know, they would say, well, why didn't Jim photograph 64? Because he was on the East Coast. That's why
Yeah.
he was in New York doing this other photography. And I really felt like I had to put context into where Jim was, why he didn't photograph the Beatles at the Cow Palace in 64, but he was back here in 65. So he photographed them in 1965 at the Cow Palace. So the Beatles knew who Jim was. They knew his work, from, all of the jazz and the folk and all the album covers he had done. They knew who he was. They knew his work. And so they were very comfortable with him being backstage photographing them. And then also one of the proof sheets, I think, showing Jim as a really working photographer, is you didn't waste film. It was expensive. And so you may finish one assignment and then go on to another. And I included a proof sheet where Jim was at the Monterey Jazz Festival, and then he was photographing the Beatles. And you can see literally in half of that
Yeah.
proof sheet the Monterey Jazz Festival and then the Beatles. So to just put in context who Jim was, and he was busy. I mean, he was working his butt off. He was everywhere. But so that's the context I really wanted people to understand. And also in there is a little bit of the civil rights, because that's what he was doing.
Mhm.
63 and 64, he was in Mississippi. So I brought just a little bit of that in. But I think it makes it more interesting. So you understand who Jim was and what he was doing.
It is powerful, and to see some of those pictures from Mississippi,
Yeah.
and the Monterey Jazz Festival, and I think, probably as a curator of his work, yeah, clearly, there are some folks who may or may not recognize the majesty that is King Curtis.
Right.
And you know, Soul Serenade is just one of my all-time favorite songs, and he was also studio cat. But again, I love the fact that okay, we're preserving. Jim preserved these moments for a reason.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, this if we were to call this book King Curtis and the Beatles, or King Curtis and some other concert in San Francisco, it probably wouldn't have as much draw. And so I love the fact that you've used the book as a platform for all of
Yeah.
these kind of other instructive moments
Yeah.
to kind of keep the legacies alive, which is
Right.
in many ways the role of a curator.
Yeah. 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 I mean, and also, I'm fortunate enough. Jim, I was his assistant for the last 13 years of his life.
Hmm.
Um, and when I was working for Jim, he was older, so he really wasn't taking a lot of photographs anymore because the music industry had changed. I mean, it just was not what he wanted to do anymore because there were restrictions. So what we did was, he would tell me all his stories. So we would go through his files and his proof sheets, and he would tell me all the stories that happened. But one of the things with Jim, and I think a lot of photographers, is they only put out certain photographs and that's it. They don't go back and look through. There are more and more photographers these days who are going back and looking through their archive again later on. But Jim, he got stuck in a rut. Whatever sold, he's like, okay, that's what I'm going to print and put out there. But I mean, there's over 1 million images that Jim Marshall took in his lifetime. So when Jim passed away, he did not have any children. His photos were his children, and he protected them and fought for him to keep the copyright when he was alive. And so he said, the only person I trust to take care of my children when I'm gone is you. So when Jim passed in 2010, I inherited over 1 million babies, which I project. But without that roadblock of Jim being there saying, no, I'm not going to, no, I'm not going to let these out in the world. My role is kind of like, why not? They're amazing pieces of history that really deserve to be out there and shown. And so, that's kind of my role as the curator, is unearthing these amazing pieces of history. I feel like an archaeologist sometimes and on a dig and finding these gems and saying, oh my God, I had no idea, Jim did that. And he was an amazing street photographer too, which makes complete sense
Hmm.
that, he was documenting that moment. And so it's just incredible. So the best ways for me to get that out there in the world is through books and exhibitions. And I don't have Jim as the roadblock anymore. So I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, he'll there'll be payback in the afterlife, you know.
Probably.
You know, one of the things as I spent time with the book Amelia is I found myself thinking less, as cut to your earlier point, I found myself thinking less about the Beatles as these kind of icons, and
Right.
more about them as bandmates.
Yeah.
And he captured that so beautifully in some of the close-up shots of them
Yeah.
on stage. And were there any pictures for you that kind of stood out in terms of Jim kind of capturing these interactions with the band, the Fab Four on stage?
Yeah. I mean, I love the one that has been seen of Paul McCartney and George Harrison looking at
Yes.
each other and just smiling. I
Yes.
mean, the pure joy that
Yes.
they're sharing with each other. It's just amazing. I love that one. Um, and I also, but the ones that are hysterical to me is there's a woman coming out of an armored car.
Yes.
That has been seen before, but it's never had a caption. Nobody ever explained who this woman was and why she was coming out of an armored car. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was try to identify as many people as we could in these photographs, because there's never been any real explanation as to who these people are,
No.
right? And why they're there. And so in particular, I always joke that Jim loved beautiful women. So whenever he saw, it didn't matter where he was. He always found the most beautiful woman and took a picture of her. And so here's this blonde woman coming out of the armored car. And the Beatles, that's how they left. They came onto the stage in an armored car. They had to leave it because the groundskeeper did not want them to wreck the lawn. So then they had to carry all their equipment to second base where the stage was set up. And then they left on the armored car. So when we digitized the negatives, it allowed me to blow up images really huge and see the details. And so when I blew up I noticed it looked like she had a beauty pageant sash on.
That's right.
And when we're looking at it, it said teen inter. So my wife, Benita, who also runs the archive with me, she's like, do you think that's Miss Teen International? And she looked it up. Sure enough, it was Miss Teen International. It was 1966 was the first year. It was held in LA. Iwa Alkin, I can never pronounce her name,
Yeah.
was the one who won. She was Swedish. And God knows what, I mean, the Beatles were there for that. They probably said, hey, you want to come up to San Francisco? She was 16.
Yeah.
They said, do you want to come up to San Francisco with us? And she, of course, wouldn't pass that up. She came, and Jim takes that picture of her. And then, interestingly enough, 2 years later, she was in a film with Ringo Starr called Candy, which is kind of racy,
It
and
is.
she's 18. So it's just so interesting. That to me was such a fun thing to learn and discover, and share with people, because it's here she is, Miss Teen International.
Remember seeing that same picture years ago in another
Yeah,
another book, and you're right, there's no
no explanation.
explanation, and I just thought, okay, groupie, lucky fan, maybe she won a radio contest, maybe
Right,
she's, one of the Beatles paramours, who knows? But but
right.
but I mean, just great detective work.
Yeah,
And then the context of her, and realizing, my God, I've seen her before in the film
right.
Candy, and just all of those just really neat intersections. That's a great story.
Yeah, yeah, that was fun. I mean, so, it was fun kind of finding these little gems in there, and letting people know, right? It was fun.
Do you have, and I'm sure, I mean, you mentioned the George and Paul picture, which is just
Amazing.
it's amazing, and when you put it in the context too, and fans and scholars of the Beatles, or those of you who are first in here, like, this was a really crappy tour. This
Yeah, oh,
this
it was
was
horrible.
the debacle in the Philippines, and
Yeah,
the kind of the snubbing of First Lady Marcos,
yeah,
and then they left that country with their lives, and then of course the comment from John Lennon about the Beatles are more popular than Jesus, and then you fit in there that just wonderful picture Lennon saves that Jim captured. So it's just such a cool picture.
yeah, yeah,
And they themselves as a band, knew that they were just done with Beatlemania, burnt out,
yeah,
and they privately, knew that this was it.
yeah.
And they themselves, and I just think too that the fact that they took pictures of themselves, they took selfies
Right. They did.
on stage, and they're nowhere to be found. I think there may be one picture someplace of
Right.
Lennon adjusting the camera on one of the amps, and I
Yeah.
think that's it.
That's it. And they were all, it's so interesting. They were all photographers. And I think later this year, Olivia Harrison, George Harrison's widow, is putting out a book of George Harrison's photography. Ringo has put out a book of
Yes.
his photography. And there was a traveling show that was in San Francisco at the De Young of Paul McCartney's
Yes.
photography. And they don't profess to be amazing photographers. So you're not coming at this as they were these professional photographers that were very serious. I mean, they even said they had their cameras and they were kind of documenting what was happening at the time.
Yeah.
They're not perfect. They're not all in focus and, color balanced and whatnot. But it's just so interesting. And that's why I think they had an appreciation for Jim and
Mhm.
his photography because they did dabble in photography. All of them did.
Yes.
So they knew what good photography was, really.
So I won't ask you what's your favorite picture, but I want you like what picture is like, okay, that's Jim. That's it. That's the one that everyone needs to go to or open up to first as kind of summing up his legacy. Is there one in the book for you that's like, oh, that's so Jim?
Oh, hard.
I
That's a
know.
really one. I mean, one that resonates with me is Ringo Starr, who's sitting in one of the cubbies,
Yes.
and a female reporter. Um, I think her name was Marion Dofler. She
Yes.
worked for the Hearst Corporation. And she was known as Dottie because she always wore polka dotted outfits. So he's sitting in there, his head is down. He just looks so tired. And Dottie is there on a stool next to him, kind of interviewing him. And to me, that's Jim. You know, that's a moment that most people would never think of capturing.
Yeah.
And Jim saw it and he got it. And it just to me, that just speaks of Jim, how he saw every single moment and just captured it. Um,
Yes.
so, it's not like some amazing photograph, but you just feel the moment in that photograph.
Abs,
Mm.
that's so true, Amelia, that you do feel like in all these pictures, even though it's black and white, it's 60
Yeah.
years later, like I feel like, and I've spent a whole lot of time with this book, but I feel like I'm there. I feel like I'm
Yeah.
sitting at the table doodling. I feel like I'm on the field of Candlestick Park, walking with them and hearing the
Right.
screams. I mean, the pictures just kind of leap out of you. I mean, for lack of a better
Yeah.
word, it's just it's three dimensional in many
Very much.
ways. It's
Yeah.
powerful.
Well, yeah, and Jim, I like to say I never feel like I'm a voyeur looking in at something. I always feel like I'm a participant in that
Yes.
photograph because that's what Jim made you feel. You were right there with him experiencing that, and that is so rare and really unusual. Um, and I don't think there's ever going to be another Jim Marshall. I just, he was he was born with this ability. You can't teach it, and he just, thank God he had it, and thank God he got into photography and left all these pieces of history for us.
Yeah. And we're just so grateful for all of his work and his legacy. And as I
Yeah.
as I shared with you before I hit record, probably and I didn't expect it. But the picture that really resonates for me is the picture of the security guards
Yeah.
backstage. And I'm trying not to get emotional because I'm thinking about my father. And my father, as I shared with you, born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and he was an usher and worked all kinds of events and concerts and sporting events.
Yeah.
And he also, like the guards in this picture, is African American. I'm African American, and just seeing these guys,
Yeah.
and maybe somebody, it's almost like somebody said a funny joke,
Oh,
or
yeah.
and he Jim may have been was probably a part of it, or laughed too, or
Yeah.
something, and they're all kind of like, kind of playing a little bit for the camera, but it's still so human. And I
It
just think
is. Yeah.
about my dad, who is, half a continent away. He's 22, he's 23. He would have been in that picture. He would have been at home with
Yeah.
with with those guys.
Yeah.
And I just felt the kind of that same kinship more so
Yes.
than I did with the, and I'm a Beatles fan, I love that band, but I
Yeah.
just keep going back to that picture, and I'm just
Yeah.
so grateful he captured that because it just says so much for me personally.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. It's a great photo. And again, nobody could get it except Jim. And you and I talked about this before we started recording, but Jim, he was Assyrian. He called himself Assyrian, which is basically Iranian.
Hmm.
And so Jim always felt like an outsider himself. So he gravitated towards people that were left out,
Yes,
that were on the outsides of
yes.
society, not fully accepted, because he felt what they were feeling.
Hmm.
He was not this blonde, blue-eyed guy. And he was a little guy. He wasn't tall. He
No.
was like 5'5", 5'6". So he was always wanting to rally for the underdog and represent them and show them and give them a voice. And, that photograph shows that too, that he felt this camaraderie with these African American guards, where it was this pretty much white event,
Yes, yeah,
basically,
yeah.
right? It's 66. We still, just coming off of the Voting Rights Act that was
That's right.
passed, segregation in the South. I mean, it's not that further past that. So it's, and Jim was able to capture all of that in these photographs.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
he does it so beautifully. And then as I think about the connection of of son to father, and I think about, John and George,
yeah,
who are no longer with us, or Ralph Gleason, who's no longer
mhm,
with us, and I think about their kids. I think about Julian and Sean, like they're looking for, we didn't have John Lennon long, we didn't have
right,
George Harrison long. So in many
yeah,
ways, my hope is that those who are looking at the book, or even the family of the Bat Boy, and the
oh
just
right,
joy,
it's
the
him.
joy
Yeah,
that they have.
yeah,
They're
I
standing there
know,
with Ringo Starr, and so I think about how how just grateful, and I'm just trying not to get emotional on this because Jim really just captures and tells our story and captures our
yeah,
humanity and
yeah,
connects us to our past, makes us appreciate our present, makes us think about our future. I mean,
yeah,
photography does all of those things. So I just think about all these kind of like little connections that these pictures are doing for so many people that have personal connections to the
yeah,
people in this book.
yeah, yeah, for sure. I know yeah, I mean, I wasn't, it's so wonderful that we're getting this response to this book. I didn't expect this emotional response from people, but you're not the people, just it resonates with them, and it is just a period in time for them. Um, yeah, and it's wonderful because that is the purpose of photography. Everybody gets something different from it.
Yeah.
Not, it's never the same. Everybody feels differently for it, and you don't necessarily have to explain it. I always hate art when you have to explain what you're looking at. That's not the
Yeah.
purpose
Yeah.
of art.
Yeah.
The purpose of it is for everybody feels differently. And there's no right or wrong. It's just how it makes you feel. And why does somebody have to tell me what I should feel? And
Yeah.
that's the beauty of Jim's photos again, is, everybody sees it differently and everybody has a different emotion with them. And no matter what, it is an emotion,
It
right?
is.
That Jim is evoking in these photos.
Truly, and so beautiful. So in closing, Amelia, this podcast is called Why the Beatles Matter. And after spending so much time, you, with all of these images and preserving them and studying them and investigating the stories, and you and your wife looking at the sash and doing all that detective work and sharing them with the world, why do the Beatles still matter?
I think it was because it was an era that again, you cannot replicate. It's an era in time. They were musicians, the songs that they wrote still today matter and
Yeah.
still resonate today with people.
Yes.
It wasn't a one hit wonder. They endure time. Their songs, their music endure time. And that's why they matter. Just as Jim's photography endures time and his photography matter. And that's the way I feel. And I'm glad we did do the book. And now this book will be out there forever,
That's right.
basically. Yeah,
Yeah, the book goes on tour, just like the Beatles did, and kind of the same mindset with the Sgt. Pepper album. Like, we're not going out on tour. The album is going to go on tour, and,
right.
and now this book is just landing at the right time and resonating for so many people. And I'm
Yeah.
just so grateful that it is, Amelia. I really am.
Well, thank you. Thanks for, having me and having this conversation. It's been fun. I love talking about Jim. So whenever I get a chance to, and we do have a documentary. I don't know if
Yes.
you've seen it. So for people who may not know who Jim is and want to learn more about him, we did a documentary in 2019 called Show Me the Picture, the story of Jim Marshall, and it goes through his whole life. And it is not edited. It's all the warts, scabs, good, bad, everything, because that's who Jim Marshall was.
Right on.
And it's on Tubi. It's also on, um, God, what is our distributor is Utopia Distributing, and they have a platform called Altavod where you can go on and you can rent it or buy it. It is on iTunes also, so I think you can buy it on iTunes. But um, I really encourage people to watch it. There's a little segment about the Beatles in it, but it'll give you a good insight into who Jim Marshall was and what he photographed.
Well, I'll definitely put all of that information in the show notes, and definitely we'll plan to revisit that documentary. It is quite good. It's been some time since I have seen it, but it is really worth the price of admission. Amelia Davis, thank you for joining us and helping preserve this remarkable piece of music history literally through the lens of Jim Marshall. Friends, if you've enjoyed today's conversation, I encourage you to spend time with this book, The Beatles by Jim Marshall, live at Candlestick Park, 1966, curated by Amelia Davis, and also we've got a wonderful essay and some captions from Joel Selvin. Highly recommend. These photographs document more than a concert. They capture friendship, creativity, transition, humanity. Also might remind you of a loved one or a parent, as it did for me. They remind us that behind every legend are people navigating change, possibility, and the next chapter. And perhaps the one reason why the Beatles still matter. Until
Yeah.
next time, peace, love, and Beatles. Thank you so much, Amelia.
Thank you. Thank you.